So we must do two things, two great things together to encompass that enormous new view that lies before us, but to encompass it within the framework of science, to see it within the whole categorical framework of science, and to see that these two are not separate, but that they are wedded. The bigness of the idea, the newness of the idea, the greatness of it is one with the structure of science, the structure of being itself.
All right, so we have come to the fifth synonymous term with its ideas, the synonymous term life, and we began to look at that as we closed yesterday. So we were taking really those first two levels of science itself and divine science through the calculus to structure the ideas of life. And it's like exploring a new territory, isn't it? It's like, it must be the way it was when the pioneers were coming across the country from the east to the west, and they kept discovering new things, new mountain ranges, new, territory, and how exciting that must have been, because we know that each state has its own qualities and characteristics and distinctions that are set apart from every other part of the country. And somehow one feels that when we're going through this seven, that when we come into a new synonymous term, it's like some place we've never been or never seen, or in terms of our subject that we have to call upon everything that we have already learned or know about that synonym and its ideas, and yet when we look at it through the grid of the four now, in addition to the four levels, something completely new seems to emerge. We get a texture and a relief, like a relief map where you have different heights of mountains, mountain ranges, and the plains, and the sea level, and so forth, that it's rather, I think, exciting in a calm and beautiful way to find out what the synonymous term is as we overlay and apply the calculus to everything that we already have. So we were looking at life from the standpoint of science itself, and we want to recap each time what the standpoint is of science itself. We know that in general, science itself would be the infinite one, the one being, capital B, the infinite principle, with no accentuation really on anything except itself as an infinite one. You see that in fact we wouldn't even have the seven synonymous terms there as a major focus. We wouldn't have the calculus there as a major focus. In the past, when we have taken the law of science itself, we have made numerous concessions in order to exercise and to call into our own awareness what that atmosphere of science itself would be. And to do that, we've made a concession, say, to the seven, because that law would be that being is its own infinite being. Full stop, Period. And yet, the human mind cannot conceive of that. We cannot begin to conceive of that until we begin to draw the conclusions about what that great fundamental means, that fundamental law. And so how do we draw those conclusions? We began by bringing in the seven to see that, well, being is its own infinite being, first of all, principle, that infinite one principle, must be its own infinite principle. Oh, okay, fine. But what does that mean? See, we always ask, yes, okay, that's better. That's a little bit more than what I had, but what does that mean? So then we imply or infer from that implicate order the next step, which would be, well, principle is all seven, right? All seven synonymous terms. And so principle is mind, it's spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love. And therefore, mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love must be their own infinite mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love. And so then we expanded that law, that one law, which was at first undifferentiated for us. We expanded it to a 7x7 matrix. And we thought that was marvelous, and it is marvelous. But then we said, well, but what do we mean by mind? What does it mean that mind is its own infinite mind? And that mind is its own infinite spirit, mind is its own infinite soul, principle, life, truth, and love. And so we began to make a further concession to ideas. To see that actually we made the first concession from science itself to divine science, to bringing in the seven. Then we made a concession to absolute Christian Science, to bringing in ideas. So we said, well, if mind is its own infinite mind, mind must be its own infinite. And then we took the whole range of ideas. From that whole range, we selected the highest ideas that we knew at that point. Intelligence, power, law, action. What else, Carolyn? Information. So mind is its own infinite information, its own infinite intelligence, its own infinite power, action, and law. And so we would go on to mind as spirit and say, well, mind is its own infinite order, its own infinite substance, its own infinite reality, and so forth. So you see that we made these concessions in order to understand that which was at the highest level of science itself and to qualify that infinite one being. But that level of science itself per se has no synonymous terms, no ideas. But as we saw at the beginning of the week, what is going on here is that we have a certain definite focus, a certain definite question that we're asking of being, that we're asking of the system. And that question is, what are the seven synonymous terms and their ideas as we structure them? What does it look like when we structure them according to the four levels and according to the fourfold calculus of being? So it's that question which is the predominant and which will dictate the orientation of the whole system to what we're doing. The whole system, now, I just have the feeling that it just bows in service to the answering of that question. It wants to shed light on that question, to shed the light of the answer on that question. And so the categories will make a concession within themselves, a concession to their own distinct and definite identity, make a concession to blend or to reflect with the rest of the system to bring out the answer. Is that clear? Good. So in science itself, where ordinarily no ideas would appear, we have ideas appearing. Because the system is taking the whole field of ideas, all of the ideas now of life, and says, when I, the four levels, look at those ideas, how do I structure them? When I, the calculus, now, look at that which the levels have structured, what do I see on each level? How do I classify? How do I categorize, classify those ideas according to myself, the category of the calculus, the four? And those are the results that we are looking at and flowing through at the present moment. So when we have begun with life, we know that science itself will say only those ideas which have the highest sense will come into view now on the level of science itself. Those ideas which have to do with the absolute innate essence of the synonym. What the synonym is as itself, not related to anything else but itself. And so at the point of the word then, the word would take those ideas and say which ideas are a kind of a declaring of what the I, life, is as such. And the word, life as the word would say, I, life, am infinite individuality. I am self-existent, with no relationship to individualities or individualizing itself, with no relationship to my individuality and how that individuality will be expressed and so forth, but just the fact that being itself is the one infinite individuality from which all else comes. And so life is that one self-existent life. And the Christ would come in and say, I ensure that that is always expressed somehow, that it's always in expression, that nothing can come in and undermine that in any way, alter it, change it in any way. So we would see that life itself is indestructible life. I know it's a term that sounds lower. It sounds lower because it's something very high that has been put into a language that sounds lower. That it explains to the human something about the highest sense of life, that it cannot be destroyed, that it cannot be subject. Life is that which can never be subject to destruction. And then we would see that Christianity would look at life in its sense of fulfillment. Remember now we're concessioning upwards from divine science and applying that concession to the level of science itself. But we know that Christianity always has to do with with an outcome sense, with an output, with a sense of containing the fulfilled sense of the Word and the Christ. And so I think life as Christianity would say, I am isness. It's that realm, the realm sense of Christianity, looking at life and saying life is the isness. And then science would come in and would say, yes, life is just that which is. Life is being. Being itself. So that's the fundamental nature, so to say, of life, to be being. And life is that which cannot not be. If it could not be, it wouldn't be life. See, these very simple reasonings, very basic, like a little child, we have to reason. I know we tend to become very complex. This is certainly a complex presentation that we are working with, but we have to, in our heart, in our spiritual heart, which is our spiritual consciousness, we have to be like a little child. We have to ask the simplest questions, which are the most fundamental questions, which are the biggest questions. What would life be if it were not being? See, what would life be if it were not isness? It wouldn't have a whole realm of expression. You see, what would life be if it were not indestructible? Non-existent, yes, non-existent. So we can always work backwards too. When you come to science, work backwards. You know, this is a tremendous method, working backwards. You recall that maybe that in the early 90s, we had a class and I took that method of working backwards. And we worked backwards because right now we're not really working backwards, we're working forwards, but you can work backwards in the divine descent, say, of the model of being, which means what? That you would begin with that infinite one principle in the model of being, and in your descent, then you would not go from the infinite one principle to the one life in divine science, but you would go from the infinite principle to the divine principle, love. For the mathematicians in here, you probably know Polya. Would you know Polya? Who gave backwards method in mathematics? Yeah. So your line of spiritual divine deduction would be very, very pure, a deductive method from the infinite one principle to the divine principle love, and then from the divine principle love to love in Christianity, to truth and to life. And then from life to absolute Christian science, namely to truth and love, and then life and love, truth, life, and love, and life, truth, and love. And then descending to Christian science, to the science order, the Christianity order, the Christ order, and the Word order. This would be a true deductive flow, and it's working backwards. Just think about it. And you can try it out every time you reach the standpoint of science. Actually, then to see, well, what is science? What is that science standpoint of being? And we should be able to gather up the Word, the Christ, and Christianity. Actually, we've been doing it in the sense of saying, well, the Word, the Christ, and Christianity are science. But we could also see that science would say, well, Christianity is that science would first look back at Christianity, and then at the Christ, and then at the Word. Okay, just bringing in various points that we have had through the years to make them applicable to what we are doing today. So that one term, being, is gathering up, you see, the isness of life. And would say then, how can there be an isness unless there is something about myself being that is indestructible? And how could I be being if I were not the one infinite self-existent individuality? But the main point, now that I've become so complex, is to tell you to be simple and to ask these simple questions. What would being be if it were not being? Nothing. Would be non-existence, as you said.